All right, I'm seeing 9 a.m. Welcome everyone to the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative's 2022 webinar series. My name is Lane Mosier, and I'm the program coordinator for SFEC and helped pull this webinar series together. You can find a link to the full event page for our webinars through December of this year by following the link that will be posted in the chat. Also, towards the end of this webinar, we'll post a link to the continuing ed credit form if you wanted to request one CE for this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube and posted on the May webinar event page in the next couple days. So check back there if you'd like to reference or share today's webinar. And I'll also get the Zoom Z link in chat for our webinar series. If you got that reminder email, hopefully folks did, then we'll just be using that single Zoom Z link for future webinars, just for simplicity's sake. So you can always come back by following that Zoom Z link. And just a friendly reminder to please don't share that link with others. Please use the chat box for questions as they come up and we'll manage them from there. Other than that, I'd like to introduce Jessica Petersen. She is an invertebrate specialist for the Minnesota DNR. Jessica?
Thanks, Lane. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you all today about bees. I really appreciate it. This is an audience I don't usually get to speak to, and I'm really curious to hear what you all have to say about bees in your forests too. So it can be a bit of a give and take. Forests are kind of a new environment for me. I think a lot of people think of me as kind of a prairie person, but bees don't discriminate and neither do I. So we've been really excited in the last couple of years to start working in the forest and looking at the bees there. So I think that I work for the Minnesota DNR. I work for specifically the Minnesota Biological Survey, where the goal is to kind of, survey the state for the plants and critters that live here. So that's been our task with the bees, is to, in part, create an inventory. And I think a lot of what I'll potentially touch on today is going to provide perhaps more questions and answers, because there's really so little that we know about bees. We're really at this infancy stage of understanding even who's here. It's almost every day that we have, not every day, but it's often enough, and we still get excited that we have new species discoveries of the state. Just last week, I learned that I found a species of bee that hadn't been recorded in over 70 years from the state. So we're still kind of scratching the surface about what we know. But obviously bees provide a really vital ecosystem service of pollination for our plants. And just their inherent diversity is kind of astounding, which I think you'll learn about today as well. But as I've mentioned, the diversity is really poorly understood. Prior to our work looking at trying to document the bee diversity of Minnesota, there had been a list written in 1919 by Frederick Washburn, who called it woefully inadequate, a list of 66 species. So we're of course far past that. But I hope that those that don't know a lot about bees will be impressed with the number of species. A lot of times when I talk to people, they think there's one bee, the honeybee, or maybe they think they know about bumblebees, of which there's only 25-ish species in the state. So the diversity is far beyond that, which is exciting and fun, and they all do really interesting things. But without this baseline survey, it makes conservation really challenging. And even with a baseline knowledge of who's here, we're still finding conservation to be challenging. So we still need to know, occupancy of sites and historic trends, which we often don't have. So we're trying to think of new ways to understand what taxa might be vulnerable to loss. And then I'll talk about the survey that we've done, and then I'll touch on some specific species and how they use the forests for forage and shelter, and hopefully get you excited thinking about bees in the forests. So we're lucky here in Minnesota to have this baseline survey. A lot of states don't have a baseline survey of bees, where Minnesota is certainly one of the first. New York as well is working on their list of bees, but really very few states have an initial statewide survey. And even though there's kind of, fervor about insect losses and in particular bee losses, the bottom line is that wild bee trends are really lacking. In this paper by Bartimaeus and others, they show that bumblebees, some bumblebees are really doing great. 27% of bee species are increasing. Some are on the brink of extinction, and the vast majority of them are kind of somewhere in the middle. So, as the climate changes and as we move forward with our understanding, there's going to be winners and losers, and knowing which taxa are which is important. And hopefully this baseline survey will pave the way for us to document species richness, but we really need to know more about species abundance and who's increasing, who's decreasing, and who's stable. And so that's going to take even more time. So we've been at this baseline survey since 2015, but we're still kind of at the infant stages of understanding the trends in bees abundance. So we'll get there, but it's going to take some time. So this is just, a smattering of the diversity that we have here in Minnesota. Wild bees, when I refer to wild bees, those are kind of unmanaged that live without help in the wild. There's about 4,000 species of bees in North America, and we in Minnesota have documented somewhere around 490. Sorry, 450 was a number we said for a long time, and now we're up to about 490. About 10% of those bees are social, like bumblebees. The other 90% are solitary. They come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, as small as 4 millimeters to as large as 25 millimeters. They do a variety of things, and I'll touch on this a little bit more later. They live in different ways, and they interact with the environment in different ways. So they're all rather unique in those respects and how they function in the environment. So we've tried to capture this diversity in our surveys by going around the state and catching bees and identifying them, kind of really basic natural history type work. So I'll tell you a little bit about the survey, more specifics about the survey that we've done to date. We've used quite a variety of methods because our goal really is to just inventory the bees of Minnesota. And so we know from the literature that using different methods is going to catch different species. So we've used bowl traps primarily. These are tiny little solo cups. We place them on elevated rings in different habitats along a series. You can see them kind of here in the distance. 3 different colors, blue, white, and yellow, attract different bees. We put them out for 24 hours, come back, strain out the bees. We just use water and a little bit of soap to cut the surface tension. Strain out the bees, take them back to the lab and identify them. We also, especially more recently this year, in fact, we've completely abandoned the bowl traps for a variety of reasons, but we're employing mostly hand netting. With hand netting, we just meander around, catching bees from flowers and putting them in kill jars, bringing them back to the lab and processing them. With those data, we get plant associations. So with the bowl traps, we don't have any plant association, but with the hand netting, we can write down and record what plant we collected the bee off of, which is a vital piece of information that we really value. There's other passive intercept traps that we've tried to employ, like these Malays trap. It looks like a little bit of a tent, which has really provided some interesting results, but also kills a lot of non-bees that we aren't too thrilled about. We aren't in the business of killing bees. We're in the business of saving them. So we're not a big fan of these passive interception traps. This is a blue vein trap that a lot of people use, and we've tried a little bit of it as well. And then we've tried some plot monitoring, which is this picture in the bottom left, to try to start to understand abundance as well. So quite a variety of methods that we've used to catch quite a lot of bees. So we have about 51,000 specimens collected to date since 2015. And about 38,000 of those, or 74%, are from bowl trapping events. Bowls catch a lot of bees. And so the vast majority of specimens have come from those bowls. But these 11,000 specimens from hand netting have really provided us with a great deal of information. We, at this point, think we get more bang for our buck, which I'll show you a little bit more in a little bit about that. And then miscellaneous, we also, we're taking bycatch specimens or specimens that the Department of Ag didn't want from their trapping that got into their traps, bees that got into their traps accidentally. And we were processing those for a while. And so that there's just a smattering of other miscellaneously collected specimens that we have in our collection of 51,000 specimens. So what do we do with all of these? We collect them in the field, we process them, and then we put a preliminary identification on them. We have staff, Nicole Gurgitz primarily, and some other temporary staff along, through the years have worked to preliminarily ID them. IDing bees is really challenging for a variety of reasons, in part because the taxonomy is also very poorly understood or poorly defined. It was drafted a while ago and hasn't been revised. So although there are keys to identifying species, they may not get you to the right answer. So we send almost all of our specimens to Dr. Zach Portman at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab after we preliminarily ID them. And that's just because they're hard to ID. We have, Nicole is really skilled and trained, and it's still really hard. And so this is a cautionary tale I tell often to people that are interested in starting a statewide bee survey or even a survey of the bees of their area, is that it's not trivial to ID bees. A lot of the citizen science projects have, I think, they're great, and they're providing us with a great deal of data for bumblebees, but bumblebees are not like the rest of bees. Bumblebees are actually kind of hard to ID sometimes too. And so most of these non-bumblebees, these solitary bees, which are most of the species, are really need identification under a microscope to be able to ID them. And then this provides all of these collecting of bees provide us with really valuable information for the future as well. All of our specimens end up at the university, almost all of our specimens we collect. We have a synoptic collection at the DNR that we would be happy to let people use, and if they're of interest. But most of our specimens go to the University of Minnesota Insect Collection. UMSP is their 4-letter code, and they can be available for anyone for loan. So that provides a huge resource to people as well, and provides a resource to taxonomists to be able to revise this taxonomy. And our knowledge of bees is improving through all this work, but we still really have quite a lot to learn. It takes us about 2 years from the time that we catch a bee and put it in a kill jar to where we're able to get those data into our database. We have a really solid database now of these 51,000 specimens, and an even larger database of around, I think, 130,000 records of bees in Minnesota that we've collaborated with the University of Minnesota Bee Lab to even further our understanding of the bees in Minnesota. But of our specimens, about 68% of those are confirmed by Zach at this point. So we have a little bit of a backlog from COVID slowing us down and the hiring freeze, but we're trucking right along, and this project wraps up a year from this June. So we will have everything done confirmed by then. But that's the process that we use to be able to understand the bees in Minnesota. It's kind of maybe not what people always expect. So next, I'm going to show you where we've been. So we have covered the vast majority of the state. I started on this project in 2018, so it was going for several years before I started. And the initial goal was to understand county level diversity. And the reality of that is it's just not a feasible project objective at this point, where we really need to understand what bees are in the state. We don't get a lot of get very much bang for our buck if we're trying to understand county level diversity, because most of what we catch is the really common stuff if we're going to places that maybe aren't the most diverse. So you can see that the pattern of the dots has shifted. So we started down here in the, I believe, started down here in the prairie region, and you can see that the dots were perhaps strategically placed on the corners of the counties. And then we moved up in the last couple of years. We've been working in the forested region, and the dots are a little bit more clustered because we were trying to really hit places that were more diverse. So we have about 4,200 total sampling events across the state. Most of those, again, are from bull trap events where we went back repeatedly to the exact same place over and over again. And we have a lot of hand net events, but most of those are just kind of one-time sampling events. So although there's more of them, they don't account for as many specimens. Most of these were on public lands, including wildlife management areas, SNAs, scientific natural areas, nature conservancy preserves, state forests, waterfowl production areas. And at the completion of this, we hope to reach out to land managers, and we have in the past, to give them a list of the bees in their sites. So if anybody is interested in those data, you're welcome to it. So at this point, all counties have been accounted for to some degree. Coochiching County, we're still lacking quite a bit of data, and that's our goal for this summer, is to kind of fill in some of these spatial gaps in the Northeast. So we'll hope that we can do that without fires and droughts and whatever else getting in our way. So just to show you a little bit of kind of some interesting data coming out of these surveys, given that we have kind of passed through already, a lot of our Northeast specimens haven't been ID'd because it takes a couple of years, and we started there in 2020. So we're getting to the point where those data are in our database and we can start to analyze them. But we can at least ask questions about the average specimens per bull trap event, because those were rather consistent across. We used the same number of traps per, same number of bulls per event, and we generally had the same number of events per year. And in the prairie, bull trapping is really profitable. We get about 40 specimens per bull trap event, but you can see that kind of declines here in the Laurentian mixed forest, which is kind of interesting. We're still not really sure why that is. Other people have employed bull traps in their forests in other parts of the country, and with I think they had more than we did. So I'm not sure why that is, if it's where we put the traps, but a lot of times they just weren't working at all. So we've abandoned them at this point in the forest. And in the prairie, even, they catch a lot of the same kind of common species, which I'll show you on the next slide. But we found this to be kind of interesting, and we're getting ready to finish up this, and we'll write a report and include kind of some of these interesting results for those looking at bees. I'll talk a little bit about this at the end too, talking about other ways that we might survey bees in the forest. So I've already mentioned a couple of times that I'm not a big fan of bull traps. A lot of people are. They really think that this is the be all end all of how to catch bees. So this is just a species accumulation curve showing the species caught per sample for bull traps versus hand nets, and you can see that the curve really goes up a much steeper, faster, the number of specimens here on the x-axis for hand netting. So this is why we're really focusing more on hand netting in recent times. We also get more unique species for by hand netting. So 65 species were found only via hand netting, whereas 43 species were found only via bull traps. And the estimated richness from the hand net data is far greater than the bull trap data. And we get some really interesting species as well. Most outstanding specimens that we haven't gotten confirmed are by hand netting, so I expect these numbers to increase for hand netting. Sweat bees we find in bull traps more than the hand netting, and hand netting tends to provide more of these specialist species that we think are vulnerable to conservation or vulnerable to loss. So that's another reason we've been focusing more on hand netting, is because these specialists that I'll talk about a little bit more are found more from hand netting. So what have we gotten from all of these bees that we've collected? We have, because there's not really a state list, it's hard to know what new state records we've gotten, but we have about 25 species that are newly recorded to the state that weren't in historical collections, and many expanded county records. So these two maps show in green those museum records. So we DNR staff also went to local museums and documented the bees specimens that were caught in Minnesota, database those, so we have those as records as well. So that's here in green are those specimens from museums that were collected in Minnesota by county. And then the crosshatched black counties are those that we collected through our survey. So you can see it's kind of interesting to me to see that we've not only expanded the number of counties, but also just the distribution. So if you would have looked at this Agulchlora pura, we would have thought this is just living in the forest, but clearly it's also kind of in this transition zone. So I think that that's helpful information to understand where species are. Many of the historic records are just not thorough enough to be able to understand the distribution. So now we have those data. We also have documented new non-native species. This is a Cleptoparasitic bee, a cuckoo bee. So they lay their eggs in other bees' nests. It's a leafcutter bee. It was first documented in Hennepin County in 2013, and we've expanded our understanding to these 4 counties, 20 specimens through some of our collections. So it's, we're learning something new every day about the species that we're living here. This particular bee is associated with urban or suburban gardens. So it's not surprising that we find it here in the cities. So the ultimate goal, of course, is to know, who's here and where. But we're always kind of curious how many bees species live in Minnesota or have been detected here. We can look at other nearby states to see what they have detected. Wisconsin had a paper out in 2008 by Amy Wolf and John Asher of 388 species. Michigan has 465, but I think that's increased since Jason Gibbs' paper in 2017. And Minnesota, we have somewhere hovering around 489, 490. But we've only detected about 250 of those in our surveys since about 2015. So, you might ask why we don't have why we haven't detected all of those 490. Well, this emphasis on mostly a single sampling method, the bull traps, is maybe why we're missing other taxa. We suspect that at least some species have a greater distribution or are more abundant than our bull trap data suggests. So some of our next steps are to go back to some of these places and try to understand a little bit more about some of these species that we've only collected a couple of times, especially those that are more common in the historic record. A lot of the specimens, at least in our database to date, are from the prairie region. So we're excited to continue to process the specimens we're finding in the forest. We had a new state record of a mason bee, an osmia from the forest that we collected in 2021 just the other day. So we're learning more every day. We have a number of unidentified specimens of Andrina, these mining bees, that we expect the richness to be far greater. Our current species richness is 36, where expected is 82. So we may make up some of that gap here soon. But we know that some species indeed have been lost from the state. Bombus behemicus, sometimes referred to as Bombus ashtoni. This is the map of the historic range of Bombus behemicus from those museum records. And indeed, it has not been found in the state in a very long time. This is also a kleptoparasitic bee. And so you might think of them as kind of being higher up on the food chain. They depend on other bumblebees to lay their eggs in their nest. And so this is likely an extirpated species. You know, the species that we know less about, non-bumblebees, are maybe a little bit harder to identify whether or not they're gone, but we'll keep trying. So we're excited to keep kind of moving on with this project. Our next steps are to continue getting specimens confirmed from Zach, getting them into our database. I mentioned that our 2022 surveys are going to be focused on Cuckoo County, so that may provide some more opportunities to learn. We're getting really close to submitting a state list of bees for publication with the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. And we're really excited to see that finally be published. And then the next steps for us research-wise is to focus on monitoring species of conservation concern. So we're going to dabble in that a little bit this year, but there's so much to do. There's a never-ending amount of things to do. So so I'll shift now and talk a little bit about specifically how bees are using the forest. They, as I mentioned, bees have a really diverse, they're diverse in a lot of different ways. One of the ways they were diverse is in their nesting habitats. Most bees are ground nesters, about 60 to 70%. So a single female will dig a tunnel, sometimes with multiple chambers like this picture shows. She'll provision it with pollen, that's those little orange balls, and then lay an egg, and then the larvae grow and eat that pollen. So they live alone. They provision their brood one by one, placing this pollen ball, laying an egg. Another type of nest that is typically used by some bees are stem nesting bees. So you may have seen kind of these mason bee houses or something. So that's just another way that different bees construct their nest. And they're also really fun to watch. And a third is cavity nesting bees. So these are, primarily bumblebees using existing cavities, maybe made by rodents or cracks in rocks or whatnot. And so there's just a wide variety of where bees live in the environment. They also, have a diversity of sociality. Even though a lot of these bees I'm calling solitary, they can live in kind of aggregations or communally in some ways. So it's really a continuum from really highly social honeybees and bumblebees to these solitary bees, where there's some that live kind of in the middle. But the vast majority of the bees that are in Minnesota, 90% of them are really this single female provisioning her brood. And there's no workers to kind of, go out and collect pollen. A lot of times they will nest in an aggregation, but they're not really colonies, just a lot of individuals that are kind of nesting together. So it's really a diversity of sociality as well. There's also a diversity of foraging types. So some bees are generalist foragers and will forage on a wide variety of plants for pollen primarily. So almost all bees use pollen to feed their brood. Other bees, like these, the Macropus bees, they use oil from Lysimachia, from the native loosestrife. But they eat nectar as well, but pollen is really where it's at, and that's what makes them really good pollinators, because they're moving pollen around. So there's many bees are generalist foragers. There's a subset of bees that are specialist foragers. Sometimes we use the term oligolectic, where they only forage on perhaps a genus of bees or of flowers, sorry. And they only feed their brood from that genus typically. And so it's those taxa that we think are probably more vulnerable to loss, because they're requiring this one plant to be there. We also know that larger bodied bees disperse farther. So, those that can move quite a distance, interact with the environment in different ways than those that that can't move very far. So the patch size of for a bee is going to depend on how big they are and how far they move. Bumblebees like this bumblebee, likely a queen here right now. The queens are out. I haven't seen any workers yet. They use buzz pollination on things like prairie smoke and tomatoes in your garden to release the pollen. So there's just again, a wide variety of ways that bees interact with flowers. Some of them chew little holes in the flowers to steal the nectar. It's just quite a diversity. So the next thing I want to talk to you about are these specialist bees, because they're a group of bees that we think a lot about. And I'll dive a little bit more into the life history here so that you can understand how and a lot of these bees use forests. So you can understand a little bit about how they're using the forest and how they're interacting with the forest. So right now we've been really excited to get out and sample the adults. They're emerging for these spring ephemeral species that they interact with. So this is a group of bees, these andrena or mining bees that are interacting with spring flowering plants in the forest. One of these is the spring beauty mining bee. So right now they're out, the adults are out. Typically the males come out, they exhibit protrandy. I'm not sure if this species does or not, but oftentimes they will. And the males come out before the females. Then the females emerge, they mate, they start building their nest, digging their nest, and provisioning their brood with pollen only from spring beauty. They may sip nectar from other species, but only pollen from spring beauty. This is just one example. I'll show you a few more in a minute. And then they lay their eggs, and then the larvae feed on that pollen and go through several instars. They pupate in late summer and then overwinter as adults, actually, underground, and then have to dig themselves out, and the cycle starts over again. So you can sometimes find these nesting aggregations underneath where there's spring beauty or other flowering spring ephemerals. And the nests aren't very deep. They're about less than 15 centimeters deep. So any kind of, soil disturbance during that time that's when the ground isn't frozen or whatnot would be problematic for the bees. And of course, loss of their flowering resources would be detrimental to bees. So here's another, a couple of examples, and these are all taxa that we, although we know about them and we generally know where they are, our sampling to date is really probably underreporting where these taxa are. So this is the one on the left is this Andrena pulmoni. There's not common names for most of these species. It's a specialist on Jacob's ladder, and we have yet to. This doesn't distinguish between, these maps don't distinguish between historic records and current records. So it's only been found in Houston County and not recently. I think hasn't been found in the last 70 years. Andrena distans is a specialist on geranium. This is the spring beauty bee that I was referring to, which we probably have documented that in the last couple of years. But the distribution of spring beauty is far greater than there's just these two counties in which the bee has been found. And then this trout lily specialist is the one that I recently detected in 2021. We just got confirmation back from Zach Portman that I indeed found it. So it's hard for us to get out there early and get the bees and find good weather days, but this is an area where we really need to do a lot more work. And these are all bees that are dependent on forest resources. They're living in the forest. They're using forest for forage and for shelter. So a couple of things that might be of interest is the amount of overstory could influence the plant phenology bloom time, causing a mismatch. There has been some suggestion of this in the literature where the plant doesn't bloom at the same time as the bee is out. And so that could be detrimental to the bee. And any loss or fragmentation of spring ephemerals could contribute to declines. So, I mentioned that these are all smaller bees and they don't forage very far. They're not going to go very far from their natal nest to find forage and then return to their nest. So that fragmentation could be really impactful. So perhaps knowing where where there are forests that have spring ephemerals could be really great, and maintaining those could be really great for bees, especially for these spring ephemerals. They're hard to document after the springtime, of course, because they leave. But knowing where these are on the landscape and protecting them could be beneficial for these bees. This is a picture I took in a state forest in the southeast of these trout lilies, which may or may not host that trout lily specialist. So I want to switch gears and talk for the last few minutes here about a federally listed species that's using forest. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. Bombus affinis was federally listed in 2017. It's also our state bee. You can there were lottery tickets and license plates and whatnot. So if you haven't caught rusty patch fever yet, I recommend it. It's pretty exciting. They're really fun to watch, and they're pretty abundant in the state of Minnesota. So we're lucky here to have really great populations. The worker females and males have this, to be able to identify it, have this rusty patch that's sandwiched between two yellow stripes. They have this thumbtack shape kind of on their thorax, the profile of a thumbtack. The queens are out right now, and they're really hard to ID to species because they look a lot like another queen. And they just have these two yellow, they don't have any rust on them. So that's the kind of the gist of how you ID them. There is some good information on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website. They recently updated it, so it's a little bit difficult to navigate, but I'll tell you a little bit about their life history, but if you want to learn more about, they have a Section 7 voluntary guidance that you can read up on, and a determination key to work through actions that you might be taking in the forest and whether or not it impacts the rusty patch bumblebee. So you can get more information on the Fish and Wildlife Service website. And if you live in the range where rusty patch is found, it's not legal to handle them unless you are permitted, but you can certainly take pictures, and it's quite easy to do. They're pretty fun to watch. So this is the historic distribution of the rusty patch. It was found in, I think, 26 states or provinces, and all the counties shaded in gray are the historic range, and then the green squares are the area cells known for historic detections. The current range is generally outlined here. It's found primarily in the Twin Cities and the Southeast, and then into Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa a bit. And then there's been some recent detections. There's one in Maine as well, but in West Virginia, there have been a couple of detections there as well. So as more people are looking for rusty patch, we're finding more, but it's still really a very rare bee. I've heard some people say recently, maybe this isn't as rare as we thought it was when it was listed in 2017, but it really is quite a rare bee. It used to be one of the foremost common species, and in our data, it's I believe it's next to last in terms of abundance. So it's really quite rare still, even though you can find it. And this is a confusing species for some people because it's federally listed. You would expect it to have, be really specific in its habitat or require really high quality habitat, but it really doesn't. It's really a generalist species and doesn't require a lot of high quality habitat. So this is the life cycle. I'll start now again talking about what it's doing. The queens are out right now foraging on spring ephemerals. And so again, those spring ephemerals come into play in the forest where they're really needing a lot of resources to provision their brood. So the queen emerges around April 10th is the kind of the federal guidance for when that kind of spring foraging impacts would occur. So April 10th, I mean, obviously in any year, it's going to be variable. We didn't have anything blooming really this year on April 10th. And so she requires a lot of spring resources to provision her brood. Once she finds a suitable nest site, so right now, all queen bumblebees that are out, which there's a lot right now, are out foraging and looking for suitable nest sites. So you'll see them kind of hovering around, looking, exploring, is this going to be a good place? And then they settle down, they find a suitable nest site, and they start provisioning their brood with pollen. So in early summer, they're creating these kind of little honey pots. They do make a little bit of honey, but not enough for humans to consume, and laying eggs on these in these cells. And so this is really where it's thought that they transition from the forest to the grassland or open habitats. So they're moving into the grassland and the forest edges, kind of that interface. And then their brood grows and grows and grows in the late summer and fall. And then they overwinter. It's thought that they overwinter then beginning in about October 10th in the forest. So just to back up a little bit. So the queen is creating her nest, she's provisioning her brood, and then she kind of stops foraging and allows the workers to do that activity. And she just continues to lay eggs. In late summer and fall, the colony produces males as well as new females. So each, I'll go to the next slide. Each queen lives an entire year, whereas the workers just live and males just live in the summer. And so the vast majority of this time is spent in the life cycle as a solitary queen, just doing her own thing, 9 months, whereas only 3 months really is where there's socialness of the colony. So protecting this queen is really important. Workers, there's somewhere between around 200 to, I think, more than that workers in each colony. We really know very little about rusty patch bumblebee. And a lot of this is kind of speculative based on a couple of known occurrences. And so protecting that queen, especially over the winter, is thought to be really critical. And she nests, or she just overwinters a couple of centimeters below the surface of the ground. So any kind of activity that would disturb that nesting or that overwintering, I'm sorry, could be detrimental. So she nests in the loose soil or leaf litter at the soil surface in these upland forests and woodland edges, whereas the nesting habitat is going to be in the open canopy in existing rodent nests or some other cavity in the ground. They do nest underground about 1 to 3 feet, so they're a little bit more protected during that nesting phase as well. And they forage on a variety, including those woodland spring ephemerals. And they really need a constant supply of diverse nectar and pollen throughout the entire season. So those are some of the things that they need to survive. And one of the things I hear a lot of times is that they're not, why am I seeing them if this is an endangered species? Well, part of the reason that's thought for their loss is that they're being impacted by parasites instead of, quality habitat loss or something of the like. So anything we can do to help them, I think, would be really beneficial to their to stop their loss, such as not impacting the leaf litter in the winter, would really be beneficial. What we don't know is how dense they are in the forest. And so we're looking to do some research into answering some of those questions, like what is their density? How many are there? Are there specific habitat traits that they're queuing in on for overwintering habitat? So we hope to have answers to those questions sometime soon, but takes a while, of course. So that's Rusty Patch in a nutshell. I think if you want more information, I'm certainly happy to answer questions, but the Fish and Wildlife Service website can also guide you. So then just a little bit more on general forest management for bees and how other researchers are looking at how bees are using forests. To wrap up here, some research has shown that above ground deadwood conservation for wood nesting bees would be good. There are bees that use, cavity or above ground wood to drill holes in and provision their brood there, as well as downed wood. Cavity nesting bees respond to downed wood as well in other parts of the country. Hasn't been a lot of this research done here in Minnesota. Bees also forage on tree pollen. So even though they're wind pollinated, bees are using tree pollen. And studies in New York by Catherine Urban Mead and others, they put these bee bowls that we're using on the ground, they put them up into the canopy of the trees, and they found that there was differences in the bee community that were up hanging out up in the canopy of the trees and foraging on pollen up there than at the floor. It's also been shown that these, early successional areas support a different community than forest understores and from these canopies. So there's kind of 3 different levels we can think about in forests, these early successional, recently harvested areas, and providing a flush of forbs perhaps, but those are the bees that are using those are very different than those that are up in the canopy, and they're different than those that are in the understory of forests. So having a mix of those could be really beneficial in a small area. It's also interesting to note, I think, that introduced earthworms are thought to contribute to a loss of forage plants, especially for bumblebees. So, and probably for others as well, but that's just been documented. So that's just a smattering of the things that that I pulled from the literature, and I'm be welcome to give you those references if you're interested. But we're really still kind of at our basic understanding of forest management for bees. So what can you do if you want to know more? There are some trainings on bee identification, just kind of morphospecies. There's also bumblebee identification that Elaine Evans does at the University of Minnesota. That I think they have them going right now, some identification training courses for the Bumblebee Atlas. And just knowing which bees are host specific, I can point you to a couple of websites if you're interested to that show what bees are specific on what plants. And I guess, leaving some natural and undisturbed areas is always great for these species that are using these spring ephemerals and such. And I guess I just always hope that people will start to notice insects and document them on things like iNaturalist if you're interested. So that's all I have for you today. This work has been funded that we did by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. So we thank them very much for all of the funding they provided for the bee survey over the years. Hope that gets renewed. So happy to take questions if there are some.
Looks like a question from Tony Miller. I host a DNR booth at our local county fair. Are there handouts for displays on bees available for something like this? Perhaps you could link that site for what bees are prefer what host plants.
Yeah, the Xerces Society has a lot of really great resources. I'll throw some things in the chat for you. DNR doesn't have much yet. We link to a lot of stuff that already exists that we love. So I can throw a couple of things in the chat. People always want to know what to plant for bees. So. Oh, I think I didn't send it to everyone, sorry. The other questions, Lane?
Yes, Mark Fulton asked, I believe this was in reference to rusty patch bumblebee. How do they survive the winter? Are they super coolers or partial freezers?
I don't believe I believe they freeze for the most part. there's just not a lot known. Yeah, they likely freeze. That's my guess, is that they freeze, but that wouldn't mean that they wouldn't be impacted, by disturbance during overwintering.
And another question, is there a concern with hobby beehives competing with native bees?
There are concerns about that. This is a fact sheet that I've wanted to write for a while. There's quite a body of literature at this point that suggests that honeybees are competing with native bees for forage. So, and they contribute to the disease pressures of native bees, wild bees. So, yeah, like DNR doesn't allow honeybee hives on state lands.
And then this is a question that I had. You mentioned some uncertainty about rusty patch bumblebee habitat preferences. Do you know roughly how open is open enough for them? I'm just picturing
That's a good question.
selection methods to create gaps or things like that on the forest.
Yeah. No, we don't know. I wish we had the answer to that question, and the federal guidance doesn't necessarily answer that question either. The kind of general guideline we've been using is about 50% open cover. To, if it's more than that, it's overwintering habitat. If it's less than that, it's considered kind of that foraging nesting habitat. Okay. But I really think anywhere there's leaf litter, if they're nesting here in the city, there's not a great deal of canopy or quality habitat. So, and primarily that's where people are finding them. So they have to be overwintering somewhere. And I really think they're just overwintering in people's backyards. So anywhere there's kind of some leaves, they can overwinter. There is Queen Quest. If people are interested, you can Google that as well, or I can try to throw a link in the chat for people to report queen sightings. It does get a bit tricky here with the federal guidance of not making sure not to handle queens because it's illegal, and so this is suggesting that maybe you should go dig up queens, which may not be great. So there is some guidance on there about whether or not, if you live in an area where there are rusty patch, what you should not do. But we need more information. We need more people looking for queens to be able to know where they're overwintering. So look, but don't hurt.
Okay. A question from Joel. Are there any guidelines for canopy closure needed for spring ephemerals? Is some partial harvesting okay in those areas?
Yeah, that's a question I don't know the answer to. I hope a forester does. I don't know, Elaine. It's just not something because I'm an invertebrate ecologist. I don't have that answer, but I would like to know. I don't know if anybody else has the answer.
The question from Eli, any specific recommendations for forest managers or landowners who may wish to create quality habitat for bees, or does the general recommendation to promote healthy, diverse forests apply? I
think healthy, diverse forests is a really great place to start. And I think, because this recent research has shown that kind of, these bees that are living in open habitats are different than the bees up in the canopy, that are different from bees down in the understory, suggests that, a mosaic of habitats in one area is really going to provide a lot of diversity of bees.
And Eli, thanks for posting. Just a friendly reminder for folks in chat, you can get credit for this for doing this webinar by going to the Z link posted in chat. And I have another question that is about one of the sources that you linked. I think it was for Tuin and Gandhi. What was the minimum diameter of downed wood for cavity nesting bees?
Yeah, I would
is
have
that, is that just in the that paper that you linked?
Yeah, okay. It may be in that paper. These are forest things that I don't cue in on. So I'm happy to provide those resources as well if people are interested. It's really only in the last couple of years, I think, that people have been exploring this idea of bees in the forest. So I really have no idea. I think they would use a wide variety of diameters. I don't think it has to be necessarily very specific.
Okay. Another question, are there any strategies chat pulled up. Are there any strategies to help offset the impact of honeybee hives on native bees? Are flowering shrubs or trees more beneficial to plant or promote for natives, etc.?
There is some considerable mutually exclusiveness of the plants that honeybees visit versus the plants that wild bees visit. So honeybees tend to visit non-native plants, whereas wild bees tend to visit native plants. There's obviously some overlap in that definition. One of the plants that Rusty Patch Bumblebee loves is spotted knapweed. So I'm sure honeybees would go to spotted knapweed as well. So it's, planting native plants is obviously going to be more beneficial for our wild bees than planting non-native plants or shrubs or trees. So that's my general recommendation. Other than that, encouraging people to keep clean hives and manage their hives for disease and pests is really, really huge, especially here in the city. There's a lot of hobby beekeepers that are maybe not well trained in how to maintain their hives properly.
Sure. You briefly mentioned some bolt trapping high in the canopy. Do you have a sense for how important tree flowers are as opposed to non-woody plants for bees? And so many species, guessing both are important.
Yeah, they're certainly both important. There's, if you stand in the forest and look up, you'll see bees up there. Certainly a lot of acer plants they're using there, but I've also seen bees go to evergreen trees, bumblebees in particular. So I think they're all important as well as the forbs, the non-woody forbs are clearly important too. And they may be important at different times of the year, right? So, in the fall we get these flush of forbs, whereas in the spring, maybe the trees are blooming. So again, that kind of mosaic of different flowering resources for bees across the season is going to be really great.
Another question, do any bees use grasses for pollen?
Yeah, they do. Just like other wind pollinated plants, they do. I've caught bees foraging on corn. So yeah, they'll use anything. They're not picky necessarily. Some species are picky, some species aren't. They generally aren't going to forage a ton on grasses, but they will.
Okay.
Yeah, maples.
All right. Any other questions from participants? We've got time probably for one or two more if folks want to post those in the chat. In the meantime, as you can see in the chat, our next webinar is on Thursday, not a Tuesday like other webinars in the series. Thursday, June 23rd, and that's looking at some adaptive silviculture experiments in Midwestern hardwood forest, so around St. Paul and in the Driftless area. So be sure to check that out. It's a double whammy between Drs. Miranda Curzon and Marcel Windmuller-Campioni. Yeah, if there's no more questions, we'll thank everyone for your time, and thank you, Jessica, for teaching us about bees and giving us a little insight into all the work that goes into figuring out how many there are and where they are. So we appreciate that.
Thanks so much.